Well met, brother.
Hello, and welcome to Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and today we'll be going way back in time to the early days of the Great Crusade of the Imperium of Man. And while glory awaits for mankind, a note of warning for the faint-hearted. This is a grim tale, for it concerns those noble blood angels before they met their illustrious father, back in the day when they were known as the Revenant Legion. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the tale of the Charnel Feast. In the early years of the Great Crusade, as the fleets of the Emperor first pushed beyond the boundaries of what is now known as the Segmentum Solar and into the wilderness space, his armies would encounter battlefields that would shake the sanity of mortal men. Of these fell and terrible places, few were more loathsome than the world known to history as Kai-Boran. The first expeditions to Kai-Boran were to vanish without a trace. 4 full regiments of the Imperial Army's Veridin regulars swallowed up and gone, which left the flank of the Great Crusade's advance wide open. In response, the Emperor unleashed his own terrors to seek out whatever beasts might lurk there. Running ahead of the expeditionary fleets of the Great Crusade in aid of the Viridian regulars, 3 companies of the 9th Legion's Astartes were dispatched to Kai-Boran. The world was a wasteland of irradiated sands, inhabited by chattel tribes of degenerate mutants, and ruled by a techno-barbarian warlord, one named Eklobia. These tribes were both bodies to be spent in conflict, and the primary foodstuff of Kai-Boran's inhabitants, each sustained by a vicious economy of ritual acts of bloodshed and cannibalism. It was these mutants which had been encountered by the beleaguered ranks of the Imperial Army stranded on the planet. Hordes of barely human mutants, armed with little more than primitive clubs and picks, had decimated their ranks. The corpses of the fallen hauled back to flickering fire pits to be roasted on a spit each night. For 3 solar months, the serried trenches of the Imperial Army repelled the mindless onslaught before the storm-gray drop pods of the 9th Legion fell from the sky, wreathed in black smoke. Crashing to the ground, the Revenant Legion broke through the mutant throng with contemptuous ease and relieved the embattled Veridin troops. The 9th attacked the camps and garrisons of the local tribes, their superior arms and armor allowing them to seize control of the northern mountain ranges, casting out the indigenous mutants they came across with uncompromising brutality. In the opening stages of the 9th Legion's war on Kai-Boran, they came upon little organized resistance, freely conquering territory, and for solar months the 9th Legion ravaged Kai-Boran before news reached the warlord Eklobia, who swore an oath to eradicate the invaders. Under his command was an army of mutant chattel, whose numbers were beyond count, and over which he held a power of such terror that they would throw themselves to their death rather than face the freakish horrors which his enslaved sorcerers might unleash. As the 9th Legion crossed into Eklobia's territories, the resistance they met from indigenous forces increased until the 9th was drawn into full-scale battle. Initially, they easily quashed any bands of savages making strikes against the edges of their line, but quickly these became an unending deluge of bodies which threatened to overwhelm and encircle the remains of the 3 companies. The 9th girded themselves to repair the tide of mutants, whose hideous deformities made them capable of rending ceramite with their disfigured nails, and whose numbers set the earth a-tremble as they approached. Though the Legionist Astartes fought doggedly, killing scores of enemies for each battle brother lost, the sheer numbers of the foe began to force them back. Attempting to regroup, the 3 companies of the 9th Legion formed a spearhead in an attempt to break through the mutants and reach the distant banner poles that signified the position of the Horde's brutish commander. As the tip of the Legion's formation threatened to reach the encampment of Eklobia, the horrors of Old Night were unleashed. Reality rippled and tore as the barbarians and sorceral chattel brought forth horrors beyond description, reaping a hideous toll of casualties amongst the Astartes and mutant horde indiscriminately, turning the tide of the battle. Incapable of combating such a threat, the 9th Legion were forced to quit the field of battle, or be utterly destroyed, a choice that might have doomed other more honor-bound legions, but not the pragmatic Revenant Legion of old. The legionaries turned and hacked a red path through the throng with toothless chainswords, broken blades, and the cracked pieces of their own fallen comrades' armor. The strength of almost 2 companies was lost in that monumental battle, and those legionaries who escaped were forced to question how they would survive and endure without reinforcement or resupply. The staggering degree of losses suffered created the need to reorganize the Legion resources among little more than 380 remaining legionaries, speaking to the utilitarian and consequentialist nature of the psyche of the early Ninth Legion. Foremost among these assets, the Apothecarian was reformed and grown into a combat support formation. The survival of the remaining legionaries, as well as the propagating gene seed, considered paramount to their ability to continue to pursue conquest. Reformed in the crucible of war, far from the path of the Great Crusade, these orphan companies of the Ninth Legion recommenced their campaign at a more considered pace, making squad-based shock assaults against enemy encampments before withdrawing to avoid organized reprisals. The campaign soon stagnated into a pattern of thrust and counter-thrust, a war fought on the back foot to bleed the foe whilst hugely outnumbered. This war, which became known as the Banquet of Qibiron, continued unbroken for 12 standard years, all but forgotten by the wider Imperium. The Ninth Legion, piece by piece, broke the tribes of the world in bloody close-quarter actions, and refused to be drawn into full-scale engagements. In the early years of this conflict, accepting the desperation of their predicament and bereft of resupply, the Ninth Legion were forced to take practical measures to survive. Raids against local mutant tribes on the northern continent became matters of domination, not destruction. Those creatures which could be of use were press-ganged into service of the Legion. Testament to the hardiness of the Ninth Legion's gene seed, even these irradiated and hideously mutated beings were considered suitable candidates for the Legion. Their children bred to be little more than meat stock for the techno-barbarian overlord, ascended into angelic perfection by the implantation of Sanguinius' gene seed. Furthermore, the Legion's apothecaries encouraged them to join their foe in cannibalism of the war dead for sustenance, benefiting the Legion and denying the foe in equal measure. These practices allowed the Ninth to replenish its numbers and continue without contact with the wider Imperium greatly beyond the capability of any other Legion. Undertaking this strategy, the Legion steadily took ground from Eclobia, diminishing both his armies and food supplies in the process, while taking that material into themselves with which to rebuild the strength of the Legion. Perhaps the Legion went too far in the name of survival, however. A diary later recovered from the equipment of a missing officer of the Revenant Regulars refers to the Ninth as the Charnel Feast, a cognomen which, when later disseminated, became popular amongst the rank-and-file mortal soldiery of the Great Crusade before it was quashed by the coming of Sanguinius. The same diary hence had a dark end for the 46 Revenant Regulars, as they became unable to continue to prosecute the war. The diary suggests they were also rendered to feed the Legion, whether through literal consumption or to allow the charnel priests, what had become of their apothecariate, to use their flesh as part of the process of creating new warriors. Other recovered journals claim that the populace of Qibiron came to see the legionaries as the devils of their myths, stealing their children and feasting upon corpses in a manner even more barbaric than the ritual cannibalism of their masters. It states that the native population feared that their own magics had unleashed the Imperium of mankind, speaking of it in hushed tones as the force of their own undoing. In the 12th Terran year after planetfall, the final confrontation of the campaign was all but a foregone conclusion. Eclobia, suffering from years of starvation, and surrounded in his fortress spaceport by a replenished force of almost 1,000 legionaries and their own degenerate serfs, attempted once more to unleash his slave sorcerers. The massed, unarmored serfs of the Legion, recruited from amongst the tribes of Qibiron, suffered the brunt of the attack, while the Legion's off-world veterans made directed strikes against the warlocks, the sheer number brought to bear by the Ninth overcoming the warlord's feeble defenses. His sorcerers dead and his fortress in ruin, Eclobia attempted to flee in a primitive spacecraft, rising from the surface in a cascade of scrap and broken corpses, only to meet a squadron of Imperial cruisers bearing the heraldry of the 7th Legion in orbit. His life ended under their guns. The Imperium had finally come to reclaim its warriors, expecting to find a world brought to compliance and ready to accept the Emperor's law. At the head of the fleet, Rogel Dorn, but newly reunited with his own Imperial fists, arrived in Qiberon to instead discover a ruined world of the Imperium's making. Upon receiving the report of the Ninth Legion, he was wrathful, as he refused to accept the compliance of Qiberon as the dream of Imperium his father had described to him. In the Charnel Feast, Dorn saw monstrous misdeeds, but also the resourcefulness of the desperately capable warriors. Reprimanding the surviving Ninth Legion warriors for their questionable judgment, the Praetorian of Terra ordered the city of Baron razed and burned, the sins of the Ninth Legion erased before a single remembrancer ever set foot there. With each victory, the dire legends that surrounded the Ninth Legion grew and spread. They were the specters that haunted the wild places at the edge of the Great Crusade's advance, the terrors loosed by the Emperor to clear his path across the stars. It was a duty and title they accepted with grim pride, never shirking the mantle that they wore in the Emperor's name, and never balking from the tasks assigned them. Each campaign was undertaken with a cold fury that stood them apart from the Emperor's other attack dogs and hidden murderers, a quiet, brooding hunger for blood and death that was as terrifying as it was effective. Once committed to battle, the Ninth did not relent, it did not retreat, and it could not be stopped. They fought until the enemy was utterly destroyed, and paid no heed to the thought of mercy, or the need to build an empire rather than a graveyard. Few among the mighty and renowned welcomed their presence on the eve of battle, for the stench of death and madness was ever on them. So, lacking a patron amongst the handful of returned Primarchs to guide them and give purpose to their conflicts, the Ninth Legion slipped further into isolation and infamy. It became home to a strange mixture of Imperial doctrine and Crimson ritual, its ranks and formations riddled with charnel cults and bloody prophets of war. The superstition of 100 worlds given power by the nature of their transformation and left to fester on the worst battlefields of the Great Crusade. Worse, the appearance of these blood-soaked angels, tall and striking, perhaps even more so when caked in gore of the battlefield, often set those they brought into the Imperium to their worship, lest they anger the Red Angels that had come. It was a slide towards madness that would see the end of the Legion. For, were it not abated, it would become a worse danger to the Imperium than the monsters it was made to hunt. The seeds of this destruction were already sown, with many watching the Legion and its commanders, already distrustful of the immortal Ninth and its blood-soaked killers. The Ninth Legion's 14th Company was sanctioned by Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists for its actions during the Second Siege of Yarant, where the Ninth Legion's warriors took to killing and consuming prisoners on the walls of the fortress to demoralize the enemy, as well as to secure intelligence. While the Imperial army brought grievances against the Legion, and after reports were filed that mortally wounded soldiers of the Malignant Rifles Regiment had been slaughtered and drained of their blood by the Ninth Legion rather than left to the mercy of the enemy during the retreat from Shedem. Such brutal necessities seemed of little concern to the Ninth Legion, but served only to add weight to those who claimed they should share the same fate as the two failed legions. Broken apart by the dictates of war and the needs of the Great Crusade, the Ninth Legion became outcasts among the brotherhood of the Space Marine legions. Now they fought in small, isolated companies, each fostering its own distinct brand of the red cults that had spread across the Legion. They still maintained a force mostly composed of line infantry and jump troops, but less from tactical expediency and more due to the Divisio Militaris's reluctance to supply them with more potent arms and munitions. In the face of this, the Legion turned more and more into its own macabre methods to win battles, prizing victory more highly than the respect of their peers. Bitter pride in what they saw as the jealousy of the others sustained them, but also served to drag them further into disrepute. It was at this moment the Ninth Legion stood upon a knife's edge. They were still a necessity, if bloody, piece of the Emperor's plan to conquer the galaxy. Yet the conquest would not last forever, and eventually the Ninth would become more of a burden in the new Golden Age built by the Emperor than a blessing. A reckoning approached for the Ninth Legion. They would either be born anew, changed and not lessened as they had been before, or they would be ended and expunged from the histories. It was at this crucial time that a scout flotilla of the Great Crusade was to discover an otherwise insignificant world of ruins and deserts, a world whose moons also had their own legends of a bloody angel, a world called Bale. And well, folks, there you have it. The Revenant Legion was no more. With the coming of their father Sanguinius, they became the Blood Angels, righteous soldiers that protected humanity through the horrors of the Horus Heresy, and through the next 12,000 years. No longer did they hold the stigma of zombified killers that feasted upon the flesh of the dead and decaying. They had become a noble house of the Imperium, led by the golden angel known as Luis Dante. Yet, unbeknownst to the Imperium as a whole, the Blood Angels still hold a shadow of their horrific past, for the thirst of blood still haunts them to this very day. I hope you enjoyed this short box on the Charnel Feast, and I hope you stay tuned for Yuxin's upcoming short on the successor chapter of the Blood Angels, the Knights of Blood. But, if you enjoyed this box, feel free to like, follow, subscribe, or become a member on our YouTube channel, Tales of Asheraka. Remember, if you become a member, you get to choose a topic for us to talk about for a month. Oh, and also don't forget to purchase The Jotunnais, a book I wrote sold wherever you can find ebooks. But most importantly, have a great day. And remember, until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.